On this Squawk Pod, one of several we are pushing out today to get you the best of our morning after the election Squawk Box. How did it happen?
I think you have to acknowledge that Trump is a gifted political athlete. I mean, he just is.
A stunning win by former President Donald Trump, investment banker Roger Altman on the campaign's winning argument.
The famous Reagan question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And the American people rather resoundingly said no.
And the recriminations soon to start.
It's going to be a slow, bitter, and bloody internal process with the Democratic Party.
Plus, prognosticator Frank Luntz on who turned out the vote.
Donald Trump's support was so intense that it did not matter what people said about him. It did not matter what happened at his rallies. It did not matter his debate performance. They were going to stay with him because they believe in him.
And his advice to Democrats to move forward.
3 names: Cory Booker, Wes Moore, and Mitch Landrieu.
I'm CNBC producer Katie Kramer. This Squawk Pod Election 2024 bonus podcast starts right now. Donald Trump, the former president and Republican presidential nominee, will defeat rival Vice President Kamala Harris and return to the White House for 4 years.
We made history for a reason tonight, and the reason is going to be just that. We overcame obstacles that nobody thought possible, and it is now clear that we've achieved the most incredible political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy?
Trump is the oldest person at 78 to ever win a U.S. presidential election and will be the first since Grover Cleveland to serve non-consecutive terms in office. That feat was some 130 years ago. Axios co-founder Mike Allen joined us with the headlines of the win.
A Trump romp was not a scenario that most operatives, experts saw. How did he do it? One, massive move with Latino voters and improving his margins with voters that Vice President Harris won, but that he did much better with, including women, including independents.
For her part, Vice President Kamala Harris is expected to address supporters later this morning. Campaign co-chair Cedric Richmond spoke to Harris's watch party after midnight.
We still have votes to count. We still have states that have not been called yet. We will continue overnight to fight to make sure that every vote is counted, that every voice has spoken. So you won't hear from the Vice President tonight, but you will hear from her tomorrow.
In today's bonus-length 4-hour Squawk Box TV broadcast, we got into the decisiveness of the result and its impact on the business community, which had not coalesced behind either candidate fully. Leaders across industries were divided in candidate support and public speech. We heard today from investment banker and founder of Evercore, Roger Altman. Altman was a college contemporary of former President Bill Clinton and had worked in Democratic administrations. He had also signed on a letter of support for the vice president earlier in her 106-day presidential campaign. As always, Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernen, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Andrew kicks things off.
Roger Altman here, founder and senior chairman of Evercore.
Good morning.
You were supportive of Kamala Harris. I'm so curious what your takeaway of this election is as you look at what's happened here. How much of this was a repudiation of her personally? How much of it was a repudiation of the last 4 years? How much of it was a repudiation of the left, if that is to be said, and what kind of soul searching or introspection you think happens on a morning like this?
Well, do we have 4 or 5 hours?
We have 3. As it happens, we have 3.
We do have 4 today, yeah.
Well, first of all, I mean, I think you have to acknowledge that Trump is a gifted political athlete. I mean, he just is. And anybody who tries to say differently, I think, is just wrong. I'm not his biggest fan, but you have to acknowledge that. Secondly, the country obviously is shifting or has shifted to the right. I saw in an exit poll, only 29% of voters in that poll identified as liberal. And Trump dominated the other 71.
Is it the country shifting, or is it the Democratic Party that ran so far left?
Well, the result, I think, is the same. In other words, I would think it's some of each. I mean, if you look at for example, and Mike was just talking about the issues that dominated, the top 2 were the economy, especially cost of living, and immigration. Abortion was actually, based on what I saw in exit polls, pretty far down the list. Democrats would have expected that to be different, I think. And Trump, again, he dominated in terms of voters who cared most about the economy and voters who cared most about immigration. Mm-hmm. And so I think the country has shifted to the right. And by the way, we're going to see a very isolationist approach from Donald Trump, which is consistent historically with shifts to the right. But also, it is a repudiation.
How come no one knew there was a shift to that? I don't buy that. We had Arthur Brooks on, and every book he's ever written, one of his main premises is the country is center-right. Center-right. The vast, take away the coast, and it's center-right. And Barack Obama could have been elected twice by a center-right country, with Bill Clinton easily elected by a center-right country. I even think Joe Biden, after the first Trump election, you can't attribute it to a right-leaning country. I don't think it's shifted. Well, no, I just think it's center-right all the time. And what Becky said, the left is, look at some of the basic tenets of the far left at this point, Roger. I mean, defunding police. And
Bill Clinton would not be able to be a Democrat running as a Democrat.
The country hasn't changed. The Democratic Party has changed.
Let's get into that. I would just argue there is a conservative mood in the country.
Well, maybe it's from immigration.
That I would argue.
Maybe it's from 13 million illegal immigrants.
But at the same time, the American perception or the voter perception of the national version of the Democratic Party is really negative right now. There's no two ways about that. And let's be honest, Harris was not a strong candidate. She just wasn't.
Now you tell us.
Well,
you didn't tell us that last week.
Did I? Well, wait. I wasn't here last week.
Before.
I think we've talked for a long time on this broadcast about how difficult it is.
We put a lot of lipstick on that candidate. I mean, that's a bad expression to use in this case. But we dressed her up. The mainstream media.
Just being straight here, did I expect a sweeping victory like this from Trump? No, I didn't. I thought it was going to be extremely close. Mm-hmm. Now that you see the magnitude of the victory, you cannot conclude anything else.
Well, I agree.
That she was a
weak
candidate. Honestly speaking, 2 days ago, I would have said she's a really reasonably good candidate.
How? You've seen her word salad. You've seen her not answer questions. We had no idea what she stood for.
Well, in any event, I think we can make a judgment now that she wasn't a strong candidate.
I don't think you need hindsight.
And
you could have seen
Trump
that
ran a campaign, give him credit, and he said this at his Madison Square Garden rally, the famous Reagan question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? He literally said that.
Right.
And the American people rather resoundingly said no.
Right.
And that proved
So
decisive.
What do the Democrats do? Do they continue to what they've been, which is kind of labeling themselves the party of resistance and going down that path? Or do they say, okay, how do we remake ourselves and try and reconcile what we are hearing from the American people?
Well, first of all, we have to wait and see who wins the House. I think that's going to be a really big factor. It would seem a little improbable to me that the Democrats win the House, but it looks like it's going to come down to 5 seats in California in terms of who has 218. And if the Democrats win the House, then I think the dynamic will be different than if they've been swept across the board.
So they would then, you think the House would at that point say no to everything Donald Trump proposes, or would they try to find ways where there is common agreement?
Well, I think it depends on the issue. So,
immigration, let's say.
Well, if the Democrats are smart, they work out a solution on immigration. After all, they ended up supporting the Langford Compromise.
Correct.
Right.
And something around that ought to be possible to do, especially if Trump is supporting it. There probably have to be some tweaks to get him to support it. But the Democrats would be smart to get on board with that because the country wants it. But in terms of your question, I hope I might be wrong, but I think it's going to be a slow, bitter, and bloody internal process with the Democratic Party as to rebuilding itself.
And do you think the rebuild is about personnel and personality, or do you think it's a rebuild around different policies?
I think it's the brand. And
it's the brand.
Yes.
What did Barry Diller say the other day? He said the same thing.
He suggested that 2028 was going to be a
But he said that the Democrats needed to, if it's a big Trump win, the
have
Democrats
to rethink.
Need
listen,
totally
the Democrats are getting killed, my 2 cents, on cultural issues. Why have they done so poorly with, for example, non-college men voters? And there's so much evidence that it's cultural more than economics, although in this election it was both. And if the Democrats...
When you say cultural, just define that for folks. What you mean by that?
I think
women in sport or men in sports, things like that. Yeah.
Well, that type of thing, transgender issues, and the progressive side of the party. And I just think that if the Democrats don't get to a more, it's not just centrist, but it's centrist culturally position, they're going to have a hard time. And, if you look at these results, Mike Allen's just talking about it, Trump did much better among women than Democrats thought he would. Last night, early in the evening, what I kept hearing was the gender gap for Harris in her favor among women is about the same as it is for Trump among men. 53% of the vote is expected to be women, therefore she'll win. Well, it turned out the gender gap in her favor among women was much smaller.
Even more interestingly, I don't know if you saw, there seems to be a split vote in some cases where you had voters who were on one side of the abortion issue, voting in favor of some of these ballot initiatives in certain states to allow abortions to take place, and yet then we're voting for Trump at the same time, which I thought was actually a very sort of unconventional thought in terms of what was happening. And that's not something that I had expected, to be honest.
Although he has said many times he'd veto a national, and he said he wants each state to decide. Do you think it was a mistake? And she finally tacked a little bit towards the end about talking about what she planned to do rather than the fascist, rapist, Nazi, Hitler, dictator. I mean, that's our president now, a fascist, Nazi, rapist, insurrectionist dictator.
Except that's not the view of the American people.
That's what I mean. Then why go with it? Why keep hammering it home?
Well, there's going to be a lot of bitterness and bloodletting over how we got to this point.
Don't say bloodletting, or they'll take it out of context.
All right, okay.
He said he means within the Democratic
It's going to be ugly.
It's the same way they took blood baths out.
So
it's going to be ugly.
The AOC wing of the party, do they double down?
Well, they always double down.
So that's actually the next question. If you think the party's supposed to move to the center, does it actually, or do you actually think that some of the folks who are seriously on the left say it was not left enough?
Well, they are going to say that because my observation, they always say it,
right?
At least in recent years. But I don't think that's where the party's going to end up. I think this is a repudiation in many respects of the progressive side of the party. Even though Harris herself did not run a Sanders-like or AOC-like campaign.
Right.
But I think the aura around the party is influenced a lot by the progressive.
I know we got to go, but I have one more question. You see in the stock market, it looks like it's moving today in a big way.
Big.
You represent and work with lots of Fortune 500 companies. If you're a CEO today, running a business, or even an investor today, do you say this thing is going to rip as a result of this? All sorts of deals are going to get made. I know you advise on lots of mergers. That it's just like it's all going to open up. Or do you say between inflation that could come from tariffs and all these other things that it's going to be much more complicated?
Oh, I think you're bullish. First of all, antitrust alone, we're going to see a complete sea change in antitrust policy, which has been, a source of great concern for a lot of people in the business community. And we're going to see deregulation in terms of energy. We're going to see a continuation, it seems to me, of the full Trump tax cuts. And I think if for most people in the business community who are thinking just about their business, not politics, you're going to be bullish. How long that lasts, I think, depends on exactly what Trump precisely does. I mean, does he really go after mass deportations? Does he really compromise the independence of the Fed? Does he really put on 10 to 20% tariffs on all imports? We'll see. But I think the initial reaction is positive, no doubt about it.
His speech at 2:30 in the morning seemed to be one of unity and positive outlook on things. And that may be part of the reason you're seeing the reaction continue in the markets where they are. But it definitely did. It seemed like it was a positive, upbeat message.
He didn't mean it.
It did. It sounded like, we'll see. I mean, this is also the same sort of message that he gave back in 2016. But he brought everybody out on set and it brought everybody out on stage, and there was a very positive feel to the whole thing.
Listen, as Mike Allen just said, he is now a really important historical figure. You could argue he was before, but really now he is. Only the second person in American history to regain the presidency.
Right. With
And this is a huge victory, right?
Sweeping.
Yeah, I mean, it's stunning in its breadth.
Could get even sweepier as we get
Well, we'll
more
see.
and more.
We'll see about the House. That's the next
But
component
the
part
popular vote.
Nobody thought that would happen.
Right.
And by the way, up until give or take 10 o'clock last night,
Easily
famous
won the popular
New York Times needle had Harris winning the popular vote.
Right.
It's by more than 5 million in his favor.
Yeah, I know, it's stunning.
Can I ask you just as one last question? I know they're going to kill us because we have so much to. But
We only have 4 hours.
No. One of the questions, and I've asked it a million times prior to this election. Business leaders come on, they talk about leadership, and they talk about character, and all of this kind of stuff. What does this say to you about that?
Well,
No, I'm just curious.
I mean,
by the way,
I think a lot of them are probably glad they didn't take your advice.
Well, it's not about my advice.
And prop up Kamala. I think they're probably.
I'm trying to be as honestly.
But
can I tell you something?
Sonnenfeld wanted them to prop up Kamala, and it's probably a good idea
I understand
they did.
that, but what look, on a morning like this, for me personally, by the way, is a morning of introspection. 100%. That's what this is, right?
Good.
If you are not waking up this morning, if you had any skepticism about former President Trump and what that candidacy would be like, if you are not thinking to yourself, what is happening here, and trying to understand it and trying to appreciate what you may have not understood. By the way, I think this is probably true of Republicans too, to try to understand what they didn't understand. But that's the point. And so one of the reasons I'm asking the question is that. So if you were trying to be introspective around this issue of leadership and character and all of that, how do you process that?
I have a two-part response, but it's a complicated question. In sort of a long lens of history, Trump is a strong man. However you want to define that. Historically speaking, he's a strong man. At this moment, voters like that, and a lot of people like that. And I think while many people in the business community and private didn't cotton to Trump, you have to just respect what he achieved here. And the American people looked through all the craziness about Trump. They obviously did. Right. And they wanted the type of leadership he represents, strong. I mean, Bill Clinton's famous comment, the voters like strong and wrong more than weak and right. I'm not saying Trump's wrong, but that was Clinton's famous comment, and that played out right here. Right. And I think if you're in the business community, you have to respect it. You may not like him personally, but you got to respect it.
Roger Altman, thank you for coming in so early this morning and helping us through this, and I hope we get an opportunity to talk to you more about this.
Don't run off yet. Let me do this, and then you can go. We don't want you to. We'd like you to stay if you could. We never want to lose our sense of humor. I almost did a Bill Clinton imitation of another one of his most famous quotes, and I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't.
Hold yourself back.
I just couldn't bring my. There are times I do. I know you think that I don't. But there are times I do.
That you don't do everything that occurs to you.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to Squawk Pod with Joe Kernen, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin.
This is a very special edition of Squawk Box. NBC News now officially projecting that Donald Trump has won the presidency. Joining us right now is pollster and political strategist Frank Luntz. We've been talking to Frank now for many months in the days and weeks leading up to what's been an historic moment, Frank. And before we even just get into it, I wanted to get your biggest takeaway and maybe perhaps surprise, given I'm not sure that, as we've been talking, that this was not the outcome, I think, on the Electoral College map, but maybe even on the popular vote that you were expecting.
And when we'd know, which was not supposed to be till Saturday.
So how come you didn't compliment me 4 years ago when I did it
or
exactly
8 years ago when you said Hillary Clinton will be the next president? I don't know, Frank. I think a lot of what you've been saying the last couple of weeks I've disagreed with. I just have. And I disagree with you saying that if Kamala had changed a few things that she would have won. I disagree with that. The country was not ready. And I don't think she was ever in the lead. But Andrew, it's your interview. Go ahead.
Frank, just to the extent, I'm curious, on a morning like this, to the extent that anybody who is hopefully thinking about this is trying to be introspective about where they were right and where they were wrong, how do you think about it?
I think that the debate didn't matter. And that's the single thing that bothers me the most. And that's the one that I got wrong.
Not even the cat eating you're almost crying about, Frank?
No, it's a surprise to me that the public and Joe, you, that it didn't bother you. And it doesn't bother the public. But the public has spoken. And what's impressive about this is that Donald Trump is able to survive an onslaught of criticism through much of this campaign, and not only survive, but thrive. That he's going to win the popular vote, which I did not expect. That he's going to win all the swing states, which nobody knew. That in fact, not only is he winning, but he's bringing a Senate with him and likely a House with him. This is significant.
And so what does that say to Frank? So as somebody who's been in this business a long time, what does that say to you about either the strength of Trump as a candidate and as a communicator, the weakness perhaps of Vice President Harris as a candidate and communicator? Does it say something more broadly about the country and policy and the way they're thinking about this, the different parties? How do you break that down?
It's all three. Andrew, you're correct in all three cases that Donald Trump's support was so intense that it did not matter what people said about him. It did not matter what happened at his rallies. It did not matter his debate performance. They were going to stay with him because they believe in him and they're committed to him. And that is half the country. Harris's campaign, in their inability or unwillingness to define exactly what they would do in the first hours, the first days, weeks, and months, that her unwillingness to level with the American people and explain why some of her issues have changed, demonstrated what a weak candidate she was. And in the end, it would have had to have been someone else, not her, who could have beaten Trump. And as far as the country's concerned,
Frank, there's going to be a lot of recriminations in the Democratic Party, probably starting with Biden and Harris. But my question is, do you think that Biden, therefore, should have stuck in this? Would have that been a different outcome?
They should have had a vote. The public had a right to choose. This is the first vice president or the first candidate for president, other than when you have, God forbid, an assassination. She had never put herself to the test. She had failed in 2020. This is probably the most important thing for viewers. Her one chance to run for president, she had done such a horrible job, and that she didn't improve after 4 years. But in the end, it's also the public's disdain for high prices, their disdain for insecurity at the border and across the country, and their demand that the last 4 years that they did not succeed, that they failed on the inflation and affordability, and that the public did not want 4 more years of it. In the end, it was the public saying enough with an exclamation point and all caps.
When you think about what happens next in terms of the politics in Washington, it does look like we may be headed towards a sweep. What policies get enacted, what don't, what acts as a governor or not on that. I know we've talked a lot about the business community oftentimes saying they like divided government. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, given that we actually have the Dow looking like it's going to open up 1,250 points higher right now.
Yeah, and the fact is that they look at Trump's policies. They were assuming that Harris had a good shot. It's one of the reasons why the stock market is doing so well right now, is that they know that tax policies are going to be different, that growth policies are going to be different. The question is, do they stand on tariffs? Because that's going to be a significant dispute in Washington, both in the White House and in Congress, and what happens with that.
So do you think all the economists, though, Frank, do you think all the economists, I mean, look, you heard Kamala Harris say it. By the way, I repeated it. The Nobel Prize winning economists who all said that Trump's economy was going to become a problem. Even Elon Musk saying at certain points that he thought there would be temporary hardship. It'll be very interesting to see what happens over the next 4 years, of course. But clearly the American public did not look at that and say that either they thought that was accurate or that they cared. Right?
And neither is the business community. They may have said one thing a week ago, but they're saying something completely different right now. And you can see that they vote by how they're investing, by how they're committing more dollars, and why the market's going to open up so much higher. That's their statement, that they agree with what happened. And my only warning is that we still are divided, that even with the Republicans gaining a clear control of the Senate and keeping control of the House with a couple, maybe 3, 4 additional seats, we're still an evenly divided country, maybe 51-49. And that I'm hoping that this ugliness and this gotcha politics can somehow subside so that we can once again have these really strong emotional fights, but do so with respect, with civility, with decency that we haven't seen in the last, frankly, in the last 8 years.
If you were, Frank, if you were running, we got to run, but if you were running the DNC right now and you were trying to be introspective to the degree you could be, what would you be telling them they need to rethink?
I'd be giving them 3 names: Cory Booker, Wes Moore, and Mitch Landrieu. All brilliant political people that have amazingly strong records and know how to communicate the values of the American people. Either of those 3 people could have beaten Donald Trump. Not saying they would have, but could have. And that's what the Democratic Party needs: people who understand and come from the community and know how to communicate.
I noticed one name's not on that list that I thought might be. Shapiro from Pennsylvania.
Okay, Shapiro and maybe Gretchen Whitmer. But I'll tell you one thing: the Democratic nominee for vice president, he's not on that list.
Frank Luntz, it's good to talk to you this morning. We appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you again very, very soon. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this special episode of Squawk Pod during CNBC's 2024 election coverage. Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernen, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Squawk Pod is produced by me, Katie Kramer, Cameron Costa, and Caroline Rahotis. John Lazration is our editor. Have a great day, and hey, keep your notifications on for this podcast. More is coming from CNBC throughout the day.